In previous segments, we've talked about how important the supply chain, especially the first segments of the supply chain, the selection from high school into teacher training and from teacher training schools into the teaching force at the point of hiring is for high quality. And in order to be able to attract good, talented high school students to want to be a teacher, it's very important to have an overall mix of incentives that are balanced. And one point that I've noted before is that if you look at many of these high-performing countries, the pay incentives are not particularly high, but it's the overall combination of incentives that makes the profession attractive. And a big part of that is that the teachers know they will be working with other well-qualified, prepared teachers in a professional setting. So, if we all know that recruiting, selecting carefully is very important, why is it so hard? Why do so many countries find themselves with teachers being hired without the capacity to do the job effectively? The problem and I'm speaking now about Latin American middle-income countries that I've been working in for the decades. The problem is that as education systems have expanded and as more and more secondary school students have graduated, teacher training has become a low-cost, easy access, higher level of higher education, teacher training schools. And very often, sometimes now they're online only, and they've proliferated. And in many countries in Latin America, these schools have started to produce 2 and 3 times the number of teachers that are needed. And the selection standards have been very low. In Brazil, something like 70% of the entrants into teacher training are below the national average on the high school exit exam. And if you look at the graph on the right, it's interesting. Over the last 30 or 40 years in Brazil, there's been this escalation of formal qualifications to get into training. And that, part of that is legitimate because 40 years ago, almost a fifth of primary school teachers had not even completed primary school themselves. So it is necessary to have teachers achieve higher levels of education, but teacher training courses that proliferate to such an extent that they're really overproducing the quantity of teachers and sacrificing quality, it creates problems for the countries. So I want to talk a little bit about what countries in Latin America have been doing for the last 15 years. A number of countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico at one point, Peru, and Chile, have all undertaken major reforms to try to raise the quality of teachers through better selection. And many places in Brazil also have. So let me focus on what they've done. So first, a number of these countries have tried to raise the selectivity of entry into teacher training. Peru tried to close down low-quality institutos, non-university training institutes in the late 2000s. Ecuador in 2011 mandated a national minimum entrance score for teacher training institutes. And Chile in 2016 has a major reform that's saying that only students from the top 50% of the academic distribution can get into teacher training schools. And they've also offered incentives, scholarships for very high scoring students to go into teacher education. Peru's efforts to set a national standard for teacher training had a major impact on the quantity of students that were able to get accepted to these institutes in the early 2000s. And it came out of the Ministry of Education recognizing that there were too many teacher candidates. They were producing many more than they needed, and the quality was very low. So trying to tighten that is a major strategy for raising the quality of new teachers. So the second strategy is to improve the quality of teacher education. And what are the instruments governments have to do that? It's tighter accreditation standards for the content of the curriculum and what the course loads should be and what the requirements for faculty members to teach in those institutions are, or sometimes direct control, as in Singapore, the National Institute of Education trains all the teachers in the country. Ecuador has set up a National Teacher Training Institute that's directly controlled by the government to try to overcome this problem of proliferation of low-quality private institutions. But you see that without that kind of centralized effort to take accreditation control of the system, private sector has proliferated, offering courses in teacher education in many countries. And now in Brazil, for example, 40% of teachers are trained through online-only courses. So there's it's obvious that the quality of a teacher coming out of that kind of training is not going to be the same as one as in Finland, who's been working in schools for several years as part of her preparation. And the other issue is the content of the curriculum. In Singapore, the content of the curriculum is very much focused on disciplinary expertise and pedagogical practice. Whereas in a number of other countries, the basic content is theory of education rather than the practical skills that teachers need in the classroom and the academic rigor that they need to be knowledgeable about what they're teaching. In Chile, they had a decade-long process of trying to raise accreditation standards. First, they said that only students could not get access to national student loans if they didn't go to accredited programs. But even then, some students kept going to these non-accredited programs. So in 2016, they've tightened the standards further, and only full-time, daytime institutions are allowed to train teachers. The third thing is to raise hiring standards through the establishment of a national teacher hiring exam. Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, Chile have done this. And in Peru and Ecuador and Rio municipality, there's also a phase of, after passing the test, you have to also demonstrate your classroom practice. In the U.S., New York went through a transition like this in the early 2000s, and Washington, D.C. has a very complex hiring process where they really worked on, a very carefully designed tests of teachers' content knowledge, very intensive interviews, evaluation of the candidates teaching a mock class. So the bottom line is, it's very useful to put a lot of effort into some tests and other processes that will allow you to evaluate the teacher's skills and knowledge and before they're hired. And we have some evidence from the impact of test-based hiring in Mexico. And after 2007, there was an introduction of test-based hiring in the telesecundarias. And you see that some teachers in the top part of the graph did not pass the test. And when they looked at Ricardo Estrada followed the schools where new teachers came in through the test-based hiring process, they found that learning outcomes in those schools improved dramatically. The same thing in Peru. A recent study by researchers at the Inter-American Development Bank show that teachers who are on the right side of the quadrant that passed the teacher hiring exam and have been assigned to schools, they've followed the impact of those teachers on the learning gains of primary students, and they found that there's a correlation between the new teachers, the newly hired teachers, and higher student learning outcomes. Something that countries often find that when they make a sharp increase in their standards is that they don't have enough teachers that can meet the standard. And this was the case in New York State, and when the test was their recruitment test was introduced in 2000, about half the candidates could not pass it. So what did they do? They said they'll give them a 5-year period where those teachers could have a provisional license to teach, and over that period they needed to take preparatory courses and plan to pass the test again. And also to make sure that they didn't have too many shortages in the school, they opened teaching positions to what we call alternative recruitment. Something like Teach for America or Teach for All around the world, which is open to candidates who may be excellent in their subject field but have not gone to teacher training school. And so allows students from other disciplines to take the teacher entrance exam as well. And that has, in fact, in the case of New York City, that helped them over the transitory period. And the payoff was by the end of the period, when all the teachers were coming in, had passed the test, you see that the caliber of the teachers in the lowest income, the highest poverty schools improved the most. Because in many systems, if you have teachers of variable quality, they tend to get segregated into some of the poorest and most disadvantaged schools. But I want to end this segment by talking about how it's not necessarily easy to develop and implement a good teacher hiring test. First of all, it has to be embedded in clear national teacher standards or clear national or state teacher standards. And the thought and effort that goes into this can be very useful, not just for the design of your hiring test, but also for performance evaluation instruments, which we'll talk about in a subsequent segment. And Chile's example of the Marco de la Buena Enseñanza is a very good example. Washington, D.C.'s also. But it's important to keep in mind also that that the implementation can be challenging. You have to think through whether it's going to be paper-based or computer-based. You have to think about how it will be distributed securely across many different hiring points in the country. In Peru, something like 200,000 teachers take the test every time it's offered. So you have to be able to assure the test security, which is a huge logistical challenge. So it's important. And it's really the first solid step to trying to raise the caliber of your teaching force, but it has to be thought through and implemented very carefully. Thank you.